Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio Channel. Tonight we step into a frontier winter evening in 1850 where the cold arrives early, the dark stays long, and every small comfort must be earned by hand. You can almost see the last grey light fading across a rough field, while smoke lifts from a single cabin and disappears into a sky that already looks hard as the iron. It sounds quaint from a safe distance, does it not? A log house, a hearth, a family gathered close. Very wholesome, very picturesque, until you remember that the wind is not decorative, the snow is not festive, and nobody here can solve a frozen water bucket with a cheerful little thermostat. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe and tell me your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights. And you step into the narrow blue hour when a frontier family hurries to finish the day before winter closes its fist around the cabin. You stand at the edge of a yard trampled hard by boots, sled runners, and a few determined chickens who clearly did not get the memo about seasonal dignity. The air smells of split oak, damp wool, and the faint sour note of livestock carried from the barn. Snow is not yet deep, but the ground is stiff, and each footstep presses against a crust of frost that snaps like thin pottery. The sky darkens fast. Out here, sunset does not linger to flatter the land. It simply leaves. The cabin itself is smaller than you imagined. Frontier homes in 1850 were often built from logs cut nearby, fitted together with as much care as time and strength allowed. Many families filled the gaps with clay, mud, moss, or a mixture called chinking, then hoped it would last the season. Hope, as you quickly learn, was a standard building material. The walls hold back some wind, though not all. A roof of shingles or split boards crouches under the evening frost. One window, if there is glass at all, admits the last tired scrap of light. You reach the door with the family as they come in from the final chores. The father shoulders a bundle of wood against his coat. The mother carries a pail and nudges the youngest child ahead with gentle impatience. An older girl stomps snow from her shoes on the threshold. A boy lingers long enough to look toward the tree line, pretending bravery while the dark gathers under the branches. Then he slips inside too, because courage is admirable. But supper is warmer. The first sensation indoors is not exactly heat. It is contrast. The room is warmer than outside, yet still sharp enough to sting your cheeks. The second sensation is smell, smoke, cornmeal, animal hide, iron pots, wet mittens, a trace of tallow from candles saved for careful use. The third sensation is texture, rough-hewn table, pegs on the wall, a floor that feels cold through the soles, even near the hearth. Nothing is polished, nothing is extra, yet everything matters. At the centre of the room, the fire works with serious purpose. It does not dance for romance. It labours. Flames lick around thick sticks of hardwood, and the logs settle with a red glow that sends warmth into knees, hands, and faces. The fireplace is the true heart of the winter evening. It cooks, dries clothing, offers light, and reassures everyone that the night can be met. Families often depended on wood heat alone, and that meant fuel was not a pleasant detail. It was survival. A household that misjudged its woodpile faced genuine danger, so the stack by the wall gets counted without ceremony. A glance, a mental measure, a private bit of math. How many days if the snow worsens? How many nights if the wind rises? How much can be burned now, and how much must be spared? You would think such calculations would feel dramatic. They do not. They feel routine, which is somehow more sobering. Coats come off one by one, wool releases the scent of cold air and old lanolin. Fingers reddened by weather stretch toward the fire. The smallest child stands very close until an adult gently pulls him back by the shoulder, close enough to warm, not close enough to spark. That, too, is frontier parenting, tender, practical, and slightly haunted by every object that can kill you by accident. Supper begins in layers. A pot has been waiting near the coals. Its contents are plain, filling, and deeply welcome. You smell beans. Perhaps pork if the household has been fortunate. Perhaps only the memory of pork and a generous amount of faith. Cornbread, johnny cake, or coarse bread may sit ready on the table. Potatoes might roast in the ashes. Dried apples, if stored well, offer a sweetness that feels almost luxurious. Frontier diets varied by region, harvest, and income. But winter meals commonly leaned on preserved food, grain, salt meat, and whatever root vegetables had endured storage. Variety was not the point. Calories were. The mother moves through the room with practiced speed. She sets bowls, checks the pot, shakes out a cloth, and keeps an eye on everyone without seeming to turn her head. Her hands are rough from lye soap, cold water, kneading, scrubbing, and hauling. The skin across the knuckles is cracked white. You notice that nobody treats this as remarkable. It is simply what useful hands look like. The father sets more wood near the hearth and inspects a draught creeping through the wall. He presses at the chinking with a thumb, as if force of opinion might improve it. Historians still argue whether frontier households were as uniformly isolated and self-sufficient as popular memory suggests, since many families relied on exchange networks, borrowed tools, and neighbourly labour when they could. Yet on a winter night like this, with darkness closing in and roads turning unreliable, the cabin does feel like a small island. The children orbit the room in widening and narrowing circles. One helps lay spoons. One feeds scraps to the dog under the table. One pokes at a frozen bootlace with total devotion. The way children can make a minor difficulty feel like a philosophical crisis. Their clothes are patched. Their stockings sag. Their hair carries the dry smell of wool caps and outside air. They are noisy, then hushed, then noisy again. No one expects silence from children all evening. They are part of the weather indoors. A kettle hums, wood pops, a chair leg scrapes. From outside comes the muffled shifting of animals in the dark. Horses, if the family has them, stamp in the barn. A cow exhales a warm ghost into straw. Chickens rustle and settle. Livestock were wealth, labour, food, and worry all at once. On bitter nights, a family might sleep with one ear open for sounds from the barn, because a sick animal could mean more than disappointment. It could mean hunger later. The meal begins with little ceremony and much attention. Hands wrap around bowls first, grateful for heat. Steam brushes tired faces. The taste is simple but honest, salty and earthy, with the deep comfort of something warm after hours in the cold. Nobody eats like a stage actor in a historical pageant. There is no dreamy gazing into firelight while violins swell. There is chewing. There is blowing on spoonfuls. There is someone asking for more. There is someone saying not so much. Save that for morning. One child gets scolded for wiping fingers on a sleeve. Another is told to sit straight. The father says little at first. He is listening to the wind. The mother notices and listens too, though she keeps eating. A winter gust sweeps along the wall and makes the candle flame bow. Everyone hears it. Nobody comments. You become aware that silence here is rarely empty. It is full of measuring weather, measuring supplies, measuring strength. A curious little frontier tidbit drifts through the evening with the smell of ash. Some families believed a cricket near the hearth was a sign of luck, especially in winter, when the smallest living sound could make a house feel less besieged by cold. Whether the insect brought fortune is doubtful. Whether it brought comfort is easier to believe. People living close to darkness often welcome tiny proofs that life still stirred nearby. As bowls empty, the pace slackens. Warmth spreads from stomach to limbs. This is one of the gentlest moments of the day, though it is not exactly restful. You can feel fatigue dropping over the room like another blanket. Boots sit near the hearth, steaming faintly. Mittens hang from pegs or drape over a chair back to dry. A shirt turned inside out reveals a patch needing repair. A harness strap waits to be mended. Corn waits to be shelled. A bucket must be checked. Water may already be skimming ice. A lamp might be lit if the household can spare oil. More often, candles made of tallow or beeswax are used carefully because light costs labour. Tallow candles smoked and smelled faintly of animal fat. Beeswax burned cleaner and brighter, but it was dearer. Many frontier evenings relied mostly on firelight, which meant the room glowed in pockets and faded at the edges. Faces came clear, then dim. Hands passed in and out of gold and shadow. The corners held their own opinions. You sit with the family in that uneven light and understand why winter nights could feel longer than clocks suggest. A clock, after all, only tracks time. It does not measure darkness pressing against a single window. It does not measure the drag of cold sheets, the nuisance of frozen water, the labour hidden in a loaf of bread, or the ache in shoulders after cutting wood. It certainly does not measure how loudly a loose shutter can announce itself to tired nerves. Still, there is steadiness here. The older girl folds cloth with surprising precision. The boy, previously suspicious of darkness, now leans against the dog with reckless confidence, as if he personally invented resilience. The mother tests bread with a thumb and sets aside a portion. The father finally speaks about tomorrow, mostly in practical phrases. More wood from the stand near the creek. Check the trap line if the weather permits. Look at the mare's hoof. Nothing grand. Yet these plain intentions push back against uncertainty. Naming tomorrow is its own form of courage. You notice, as too, that winter narrows attention to immediate truths. Is the fire sound? Are the children fed? Is there enough meal in the barrel? Did the latch hold? Has the meat been salted well? Grand ideas may exist, certainly. Frontier families held politics, beliefs, ambitions, grievances, loyalties. But on a cold 1850 evening, lofty thought must politely wait while somebody gets the frost from a hinge. Outside, the darkness is complete now. The cabin window reflects only fire and moving figures. Beyond that glass, or oiled paper, or thin opening, the world vanishes into a black so total it feels physical. No porch light waits outside. No road lantern glows in the distance. Night on the frontier could be astonishingly dark, especially away from towns. For many people, that darkness was not just visual, it was emotional. It sharpened every sound and enlarged every possibility. The wind rises again and drags a dry whisper over the roof. Something taps once against the wall. A branch, perhaps? Or the night entertaining itself. The youngest child looks up. The mother says it is nothing in a tone that means it might be something, but nothing that can be helped tonight. This is another frontier skill. Distinguishing between danger and mere discomfort. Learning not to donate your full imagination to every sound. The fire settles lower, then flares as another stick is added. The light briefly brightens the room. You see the grain of the table, the iron hook by the hearth, the lines of wear around the door latch where countless cold hands have gripped it. You see tiredness in every posture. You also see endurance, quieter than heroism and far more useful. The evening deepens. The family draws closer to the hearth, not out of sentiment alone, but because heat gathers there and nowhere else does. You feel the rough weave of a wool blanket brushed over your knees. You hear the soft hiss of moisture leaving a boot. You smell ash, stew, and clean coal still clinging to hair and cuffs. The cabin is humble, imperfect, draughty, and absolutely alive. For all the hardship, there is a kind of intimacy winter forces upon the room. Work, food, warmth, worry, and companionship are packed together so tightly that nobody can pretend life is separate from anyone else's. Every task touches another task. Every comfort depends on someone's labour. Every person changes the feel of the evening simply by being present. In that sense, a frontier winter night is not silent or empty at all. It is dense with human effort, and so you remain there as the first real hours of darkness take hold, watching a family in 1850 gather itself against the cold with wood, food, routine, caution, and a stubborn refusal to let winter have the final word. The room settles into evening proper once the meal is done, and that is when you begin to notice what winter supper really means on the frontier. It is not only food, it is heat borrowed from the fire, time borrowed from labour, and a brief softness tucked inside a hard season. The bowls are still warm in your hands. The last steam fades from the pot. A spoon knocks gently against crockery. Small sounds grow large in a log cabin at night, especially when the world outside has gone still and black. You sit close enough to the hearth to feel one side of your body warming while the other remains cool. This was a very common frontier experience, You could roast in front and freeze behind, which is a fine lesson in humility if you have ever trusted a fire too much. The flames pull at the wood with a patient crackle. Resin in a knot hisses for a moment. Ash lifts and settles. The smell is thick and familiar now. Part smoke, part sap, part the faint mineral scent of heated stone. Everything in the room absorbs it. Hair, blankets, coats, breadcloths, even the sleeping dog. The table must be cleared, of course, because comfort never stays unaccompanied for long. The mother begins stacking bowls with the calm efficiency of someone who has repeated the same gestures thousands of times. One child carries spoons in a fist, very proud of this major public office. Another wipes crumbs with a cloth that probably deserves gentler treatment. The father tips the kettle to see how much water remains. Nothing is done casually. Every scrap, every utensil, every dipper of water has a place and a consequence. Water itself is a nightly concern. On a winter frontier evening, it might have been hauled from a well, a stream, a spring, or melted from snow when nothing else was practical. None of those options is charming when your fingers are already cracked from cold. Snow can be used, yes, but it takes a surprising amount to produce a useful amount of water. Nature, in its usual kindly fashion, offers a field full of white fluff and lets you discover that it melts into almost nothing, so the remaining water in the bucket is watched with care. Dishes are washed in stages, not because anyone enjoys the process, but because grease and soot have no intention of removing themselves. A basin is set out. Water is warmed. Hands go in and out of steam. The smell of supper gives way to the smell of wet pottery, old wood, and strong homemade soap. Lye soap was common in many households, made from animal fat and lye. It did the job, which was its main virtue. Delicacy was not invited. Skin often came away clean and slightly offended. The older children help because they are expected to help. Frontier family life usually depended on labour shared by all who were old enough to manage it. Childhood existed, certainly, but it worked for a living. A girl might wipe bowls dry with a flour sack towel. A boy might carry in another armload of wood, his boots clumping on the floorboards. Even small children could sort beans, gather chips for kindling, or hold a candle while someone searched under a bed. Nobody here is cultivating hobbies. The cabin itself is the hobby, the workplace, the refuge, and the ongoing engineering problem. Once the table is cleared, the room opens a little. Not in size, of course. Cabins were often small, and many families lived in 1 or 2 rooms with lofts above. But the evening changes shape. Eating has ended. Night work begins. This part would surprise people who imagine winter nights as long, dreamy stretches of quiet storytelling. There might be stories later. There might be laughter. There might be a song. But first there is the great parade of little tasks that march directly out of supper and into darkness. A basket is brought closer to the firelight. Socks, shirts, and work trousers wait inside, all needing something. A hem has come loose. A knee has torn. A mitten has worn through at the thumb. Cloth was too valuable to waste, and mending was a normal part of keeping a family clothed through winter. The mother threads a needle with practiced fingers. The older girl does the same. The younger children watch for a while, interested until they are not, which happens at the speed of childhood. You notice how the firelight changes the sewing. Needles flash, then disappear. Thread shines pale for an instant. Shadows lie across the cloth in crooked bands. Eyes must work hard in this light. Many adults on the frontier likely strained their vision during long evenings, especially in winter when darkness came early and useful light cost money or labour. Candlelight and firelight are beautiful in paintings. In real life, they can turn a simple seam into an argument between your eyes and your patience. The father draws his chair to the side and begins repairing a tool handle. The wood smells freshly cut where the old piece snapped. He turns it in his hands, tests the grain, pares a little with a knife, then fits and tests again. Men often used winter evenings for maintenance work of this kind. Repairing harness, sharpening blades, shaping pegs, or making whatever the household needed and could not easily buy. Store goods existed, but they were not always close, affordable, or available. Self-reliance was partly a virtue and partly geography. A wonderful odd little detail of frontier life appears beside the hearth. Corn cobs, once stripped of kernels, could still find a second career in the household. They might be burned, used in simple cleaning tasks, or kept for practical purposes best left described with modest vagueness during a bedtime history. Nothing much was wasted if another use could be found for it. Objects lived several lives before they were allowed to die. The children, their serious help now complete or declared complete with suspicious speed, drift toward quieter amusements. One lies on the floor near the dog, tracing shapes in a patch of firelight. Another plays with scraps of wood, arranging them into a tiny fort or wagon. A little girl rocks a rag doll with one shoe missing and a face faded almost away. Toys on the frontier were often homemade, repaired, and cherished through hard use. Fancy shop-bought delights were less common than ingenuity. From time to time, an adult speaks without looking up. Do not sit so close to the fire. Mind the needle. Leave the cat alone. Stop thumping that on the floor. It is the music of family life, practical and repetitive, yet oddly soothing in its own rhythm. Nobody's making speeches. Nobody's trying to create a perfect memory. They are simply keeping the night in order. Outside, the cold deepens. You hear it in indirect ways. The sharper whistle at the corner of the cabin, the change note of the wind when it passes the chimney, the slight creak in the logs as the structure answers the drop in temperature. Wood, hide, cloth, iron, and skin all behave differently when winter tightens its grip. Even the room feels more fragile under that pressure, as though the firelight must continuously defend it from the dark. A candle is lit at last, and the smell of hot tallow joins the air. The flame is smaller and steadier than the fire, and its light falls more directly on hands and cloth. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were common but not especially elegant companions. They could smoke, gutter, and carry a distinct smell. Beeswax was finer, but many households saved it for better circumstances. On an ordinary frontier night, ordinary light would do. You begin to understand that winter evenings shaped people through repetition. The same chores, the same sounds, the same care with supplies, the same need to prepare for morning before lying down at night. There is a discipline in that pattern, and also a kind of quiet mental strain. Modern life exhausts people with speed. Frontier life often exhausted them with persistence. The work did not come in thrilling bursts. It just kept returning, dressed in different aprons. At the far side of the room, a small sack of dried apples is opened, not for eating freely, certainly not that, but to inspect for spoilage. Preserved food demanded attention. Dried fruit, smoked meat, sacks of grain, crocks of pickles, barrels of flour, and jars of whatever could be put by had to be checked through the winter. Moisture, pests, mould, and simple bad luck could ruin stores a family depended on. A woman pinches a slice of apple, nods, and ties the bag again. Such a tiny motion, and yet the household's future hides inside it. Historians still debate how uniform frontier domestic life truly was across regions, because winter in Ohio, Missouri, Wisconsin, or upstate New York could produce very different routines, building styles, foods, and rhythms. The image of one generic frontier family is tidy, but the reality was more local. German immigrant households, Scots-Irish families, free black settlers, French communities, and many others carried different habits into similar hardships. Even so, the broad truth remains that winter night narrowed choices for almost everyone. You feel the rough nap of a blanket brushed over your legs. Wool can scratch a bit, especially when dry from hearth heat, but it keeps warmth better than elegance ever could. Wool, linen, and homespun fabrics did much of the heavy lifting in frontier clothing and bedding. Cotton was present too. Though less useful alone in severe cold, layering mattered, so did proximity. Sharing blankets or sleeping close was not a sentimental innovation. It was thermal management with family values attached. A sudden pop from the fire makes the youngest child jump. A tiny coal lands on the hearthstone and goes dark. Everyone glances over. Fire was precious, but it was also a constant threat. Cabins made of dry wood, filled with cloth, straw ticks, and hanging garments, needed careful watching. Chimneys could fail. Sparks could leap. A candle tipped by a careless hand might turn domestic comfort into disaster. That low current of caution runs under the whole evening. Someone begins shelling nuts. The sound is small and satisfying, a crisp crack followed by the careful picking free of the meat inside. Black walnuts, hickory nuts, chestnuts in some regions. Whatever had been gathered and saved could become both food and occupation. Idle fingers were rarely allowed to stay idle long. A spare moment usually attracted a task the way lamplight attracts moths. Then the talk begins to lengthen. Not dramatic talk. No whispered confessions or sudden revelations worthy of a novel. Just the ordinary exchange that fills a room once hands are busy and hunger has eased. A question about whether the weather might change. A remark on a stubborn hen. A suspicion that the younger calf has a cough. Someone repeats a bit of news heard weeks ago from a traveller or neighbour. Frontier information moved at human speed by wagon, horseback, rumour, and memory. By the time an item of news reached a remote cabin, it had often gathered dust and opinion in equal measure. One quirky practice from some rural households was the careful saving of ashes from the hearth. Wood ash could be used in soap making, in cleaning, on icy paths, and in various household tasks. What looks like waste by candlelight may become tomorrow's necessity by sunrise. That practical habit says a lot about frontier thinking. The line between rubbish and resource was thin. The father tests the repaired handle again, then sets it aside with the small satisfaction of something made sound. The mother knots off a thread with her teeth and lifts another garment from the basket. The children droop slowly, their energy folding in on itself. Their cheeks shine from heat and recent scrubbing. Their eyelids grow heavy, though they resist sleep with the strange moral passion only children can bring to bedtime. To them, going to bed is an injustice. To the adults, it is a logistical campaign. The smell of the room thickens as night deepens. Smoke in the chimney, warm iron, tallow, damp leather drying by the hearth. The faint animal smell of coats and boots used all day in yard and barn. It is not perfume. It is household weather. You could close your eyes and know exactly where you are. And in that dense, flickering air you sense how winter supper did more than fill stomachs. It gathered the family into one working circle, where food, labour, warmth, and fatigue blended until they were hard to separate. Supper smoke clung to the rafters. Firelight pooled on the floor. Needles moved, wood shavings curled, children yawned. The night outside waited without hurry, vast and black. While inside the cabin every small act of care helped keep the cold from becoming master of the place. By the time full darkness has settled around the cabin, you might imagine the household finally sinking into rest. That would be a charming idea, and also a very modern one. On the frontier in 1850, winter night does not end the labour. It merely changes its clothing. Daylight work moves indoors, softens at the edges, and continues by fire and candle with a stubborn little sigh. You feel it first in the room's posture. Nobody is relaxed in the grand luxurious sense. People lean, pause, and stretch. Yes, but their hands remain occupied. The quiet is not empty. It is threaded with effort. A chair shifts closer to the hearth. A stool is turned to catch better light. A basket is opened. A tool is lifted. The evening becomes a workshop disguised as domestic peace. One of the oldest rhythms of frontier life appears now in the form of mending. You watch a shirt laid across a lap, inside out, the elbows thinned almost to honesty. Cloth is examined by touch as much as sight. Fingers test where the weave still has life and where it has nearly surrendered. A patch is cut from another worn piece. Nothing matches especially well. Perfection would be an expensive habit. Sturdiness matters more. A needle slips through fabric with small, decisive motions. The sound is barely there, just the faint whisper of thread drawing tight. You can smell singed wool from something that sat too near the fire earlier. The mother works steadily, shoulders slightly rounded from long use and longer responsibility. The older girl sews too, though she pauses now and then to squint at a seam in the wavering light. Candlelight flatters faces and betrays stitches. Still, the work goes on. The father has his own share of indoor evening labour. A harness strap lies across his knee, cracked at the bend where leather has grown stiff from cold and repeated use. He rubs in grease with his thumb, working the stuff into the darkened surface. The smell rises rich and animal, blending with smoke and tallow and old wood. He bends, tests, trims, pierces a hole with an awl, then threads a repair through with rough patience. Harness, reins, collars, traces. All these pieces matter deeply on a farm or homestead. A broken strap in the wrong weather could waste a day or injure an animal. So winter night becomes the time when tomorrow's failures are quietly prevented. On the floor, a boy has been given a task important enough to feel almost like honour and dull enough to be unquestionably real. He shells dried beans into a pan. The pods crack open between cold, reddened fingers. The beans rattle out with a sound like tiny pebbles. Some bounce. One escapes across the floor. The dog notices immediately and decides it may be edible, which begins a brief dispute conducted almost entirely in whispers. No frontier child was ever too busy to argue over a bean if given the chance. The room holds many textures at once. Rough linen, splintered chair arms worn smooth where hands always land, the dry rasp of corn husks, the thick drag of wool, the oily firmness of leather. Touch mattered in a world of constant making and repair. A person could tell by hand whether flour had taken damp, whether a boot had cracked too far, whether the chinking near the wall had loosened again. Eyes were useful. Fingers were experts. A small pile of corn cobs waits in one corner, and soon ears of dried corn are brought out to be shelled. This is work well suited to winter evening, repetitive and necessary, the kind that frees the mind just enough for talk. Kernels strike the bottom of a wooden bowl with a hard, cheerful patter. Hands move automatically after a while, twisting, pushing, stripping yellow and pale white grain into the growing heap. Corn was central to many frontier diets, fed to both people and animals in one form or another. Mush, bread, meal, feed. A field of corn was not picturesque decoration. It was insurance in rows. You notice how children learn through proximity. Nobody gathers them around for a lecture on frontier values. Nobody presents a chalkboard titled Useful Character Formation at night. They simply sit near working adults and absorb what hands do when daylight fails. A boy watches how to fit a blade back into a handle. A girl learns how to turn cloth so a patch lies flat without bunching. A younger child knots string badly, then a little less badly. Skill spreads through repetition, correction, and the mild embarrassment of doing something foolish in front of people who have no time for foolishness. There is, however, room for a little humour. It slips out in brief comments and dry glances. Someone holds up a sock with so many repairs that the original fabric seems present mostly as a rumour. Someone says the sock has lived longer than a county judge. A child giggles. The father snorts without looking up. Gentle sarcasm has excellent survival value in cramped winter quarters. It costs nothing and warms the mood a bit. A mainstream fact of frontier life sits plainly in this scene. Most rural households in 1850 depended on hand labour for nearly every basic need, especially in winter, when transportation could be difficult and daylight short. Clothing, tools, food stores, fuel, and shelter all demanded maintenance. The frontier was not a place where life became simple. It was a place where every simple thing revealed how much work had been hiding inside it. One of the more curious details of winter domestic work comes from the humble practice of twisting scraps into use. Bits of old cloth became patches, ties, rag dolls, quilt pieces, bandages, cleaning rags, or lamp wicks in a pinch. Even worn stockings might be cut down and turned into something smaller. Objects on the frontier did not retire with dignity. They were promoted sideways. The candle gutters once, and a hand rises immediately to shield it from a draught. That moment says everything about the room. Light is useful, but fragile. The flame straightens again, and faces return to view in a soft amber band. Beyond it, the corners stay obscure. A cradle may be half visible. A chest sits against the wall like a shadow with hinges. Near the door, boots stand in a crooked line, drying but never truly dry. Leather that stiffens by cold can torment feet the next morning, so it is worked, warmed, and coaxed back toward obedience. At the table, a small slab of wood has become another project. The father begins shaving pegs from it, one after another, each one curled free by a knife with practiced pressure. Pegs are easy to overlook when thinking about history. They do not carry the glamour of rifles or wagons or grand speeches, yet pegs hold shelves, doors, harness loops, clothing, and all sorts of ordinary life together. A frontier household consumed tiny useful objects constantly, and many were made by hand in these very evening hours. You hear the weather through the cabin more than you see it. Wind presses and releases against the walls. A loose board gives a faint complaint. Sometimes the chimney speaks in a low hollow murmur. Sometimes the outside turns strangely still, and that stillness feels more intense than noise. When the world beyond the fire goes quiet, each indoor sound sharpens. The click of a thimble, a cough, the dry scratch of a knife edge over wood, the sigh of someone easing a sore back. Soreness belongs to the room as surely as the chairs do. Bodies that have hauled, chopped, scrubbed, stooped, lifted, and walked through frost all day do not glide into evening untouched. A man rubs the heel of one hand into his shoulder. A woman flexes her fingers before taking up another seam. A child pulls off one shoe and kneads a tired foot absent-mindedly. Nobody announces pain dramatically. It is accepted, worked around, folded into the household like another common tool. Historians still dispute how much leisure frontier families truly had in winter evenings, because the answer changed sharply depending on region, wealth, season, household size, and whether essential tasks had already been completed before cold weather deepened. Some memoirs suggest moments of song, reading, and relaxed visiting. Others make winter sound like a long campaign of work and endurance. The truth was likely uneven. Some nights allowed a little breathing room, others did not. Tonight, the labour remains steady but not desperate. That difference matters. There is enough calm in the room for conversation to gather properly. News is exchanged in fragments. Someone recalls a neighbour's horse throwing a shoe on the road. Someone wonders whether a trader may come through before the snow deepens. A child asks a question about whether birds get cold on their feet. The answer, unsatisfying but sincere, is probably, the child accepts this with the solemn interest usually reserved for kings and monsters. A book may appear if the family owns one, and if the light can be spared. The Bible was common in many homes. So were almanacs, a few school readers, hymnals, or perhaps a cherished borrowed volume. Reading aloud happened in some households, especially where at least one member read well enough to carry the others along. Yet reading by candlelight after a full day's labour was never as effortless as modern people imagine. Eyes grew tired. Candles cost something. A body aching from cold did not always long for literature, however worthy. Sometimes a person wanted only to sit and let the fire do the talking. In one corner, a woman winds yarn. The wool passes through her fingers with a faint drag, soft and slightly oily. The yarn ball grows slowly. Knitting often filled winter evenings because stockings, mittens, caps, and comfort all had a direct relationship to yarn. Spinning might happen earlier in the season, but winding, knitting, and piecing out what remained continued as needed. The domestic economy of cloth was enormous, especially in places where store goods were distant or dear. A younger child grows drowsy and contrary at once, that classic frontier combination. He leans into an adult's skirt, then resists being sent toward bed. His face is warm from the fire, but his hands are cool. He smells of smoke, sleep, and the faint sweet mustiness of wool. He is given a small job to settle him, perhaps sorting buttons from a tin or picking over a handful of dried peas. He performs it with the gravity of a magistrate for nearly 3 minutes. Then his chin droops. The room's atmosphere thickens as the evening advances. Wood smoke clings under the rafters. The fire pulses heat in waves against your shins. The floor remains cool enough to remind you of the season every time you shift your feet. Candle wax softens. Shadows swing on the wall when someone passes. The cabin is one small bright pocket pressed against an enormous dark. Now and then, a task reveals how carefully people counted materials. Thread is cut only as long as needed. A patch is measured against the garment twice before the scissors touch cloth. Wax drippings are not ignored. A good bit of twine is saved, coiled, and tucked away. Frontier households often lived close to the margin where thrift was not a virtue performed for moral beauty, but a practical defence against want. Waste today had a way of returning next month with very poor manners. A quirky bit of domestic craft enters the scene when one of the children begins plating corn husks that had been softened slightly for use. Corn husks could become mats, doll filling, chair seat stuffing, and small woven trifles. The plait is clumsy, then less clumsy, then suddenly recognisable as a useful thing. Such work gave restless hands occupation and helped stretch harvest remains into household value. Even a plant's leftovers were expected to contribute. The father sets aside the harness and takes up a whetstone. The knife blade slides across it with a steady soft scrape. Metal meeting stone in patient rhythm. Sharpening is a winter sound all its own. Not loud, not urgent, but serious. A sharp tool saves effort and sometimes saves flesh. A dull one asks for trouble. The boy shelling beans watches with open interest. Every child understands instinctively that blade work is both fascinating and restricted, which of course increases fascination tenfold. Someone yawns widely enough to make the others laugh. Another suppresses a smile and fails. A moment later the room quiets again. These small shifts in mood feel intimate, almost tidal. In cramped quarters, emotions do not have far to travel. Irritation, humour, fatigue, tenderness, all move quickly through shared air. You begin to grasp that labour after sundown has a special quality distinct from daylight work. It is less visible to memory, perhaps because it leaves fewer grand images, no plough cutting soil, no wagon crossing open land, no dramatic chopping against a snowy backdrop. Instead, there are quieter acts that keep life from fraying. Stitch, scrape, sort, grease, tie, sharpen, mend. This is the understructure of survival, hidden in ordinary hands and repeated so often it could almost disappear from the historical record if nobody bothered to look closely. But here, in this winter room, it does not disappear. It glows briefly in firelight. It smells of wool and leather and hot iron. It sounds like kernels tapping wood and thread whispering through cloth. It feels like rough fibre against your fingertips and warmth on one cheek while the other cools in the draught. It is tiring work, humble work, often invisible work, yet it keeps coats wearable, tools steady, food ready, and morning possible. At last, one task is finished, then another. A patched shirt is folded, a sharpened knife is set aside. Beans fill the pan. The repaired strap hangs from a peg to settle. None of it seems grand. All of it matters. And as the winter night deepens around the cabin, you sit within the patient industry of a frontier family and see that rest, when it eventually comes, is built by countless small acts performed in the dim, honest hours after sundown. As the hour grows later, the work in the cabin loosens its grip just enough for shadows to gain character. Firelight shifts over the walls in long, uneven bands. The candle has burned lower. The room has not changed in size, yet it feels larger now, as if darkness has opened secret corners inside it. This is the hour when children begin to notice things adults have learned to ignore. A coat hanging by the door becomes a stranger with broad shoulders. A bundle of herbs drying from a peg turns into a drooping little ghost. The cradle rocker, nudged by accident, gives one soft creak that seems much too thoughtful for plain furniture. You sit near the hearth and understand, at once, why winter nights fed so many stories. A frontier cabin after dark does half the storytelling by itself. The children edge closer together without admitting that they are doing it. One leans against a sister's shoulder, another curls near the dog and keeps one hand buried in its fur. Warm fur helps. So does pretending not to be afraid. The boy who swaggered through chores now studies the far wall with narrowed eyes, as though he alone has been appointed inspector of suspicious shadows. Very brave, very official, deeply unconvinced. An adult notices and says nothing for a while. That is often the way in family rooms. Fear does not always need a speech. It needs a little time to settle and show its shape. The mother draws another stitch through cloth, then asks one of the children to fetch a wooden cup from the table. The child hesitates, glances toward the dim edge of the room, then goes. This tiny journey from firelight to shadow and back again may be the evening's true test of character. He returns successfully, which improves the state of civilization. Children on the frontier were not protected from darkness in the modern sense. Night was part of the life, not a special event. They saw candle flames fail, heard weather move around the house, and learned early that the world outside the door could not be brightly inspected on command. Yet familiarity did not erase imagination. It often sharpened it. A child who spends winter evenings in a small cabin with patchy light, animal noises, and talk of storms has no trouble inventing dramatic possibilities, so stories begin to stir. Not formal stories at first, more like fragments. Someone mentions hearing an owl the night before. Someone else claims a fox screamed near the woodlot once and sounded like a lost soul. A younger child immediately regrets hearing this. An older one is delighted. This is the natural order of sibling entertainment. The father says dryly that most noises in the dark are either wind, wood, or creatures minding their own business. That should settle things. It does not. It merely gives everyone new categories in which to place their fears. Was that sound wind, wood, or creature? Excellent. Now there are 3 worries instead of 1. You hear the room breathing between these remarks. The fire cracks softly. The dog huffs in sleep. A spoon is set down. A log shifts and sends a brief rush of sparks up the chimney. The smell of smoke stays steady, mixed with warm wool, cooling supper, and the faint, dusty scent of dried herbs. Outside, the night presses close. Inside, words start to fill the space it leaves. Storytelling was common in many homes, though not always in the polished fairy tale form people now imagine. Families traded recollections, warnings, bits of humour, local gossip, and scraps of lore carried from older generations. On winter nights, such talk could entertain, instruct, and keep drowsiness at bay while smaller tasks finished in tired hands. A story was useful if it held attention, passed along a lesson, or made a child think twice before wandering near thin ice. One child asked for a tale, not a baby tale, of course. Something true, or mostly true. This distinction is important to children, who often demand realism right up until the moment it becomes alarming. The mother smiles faintly but keeps sewing. The father pokes the fire and gives a short account of a traveller caught in a snow squall who followed his own wagon tracks in circles before finding a cabin light. It is not presented dramatically. That makes it better. The children listen with wide eyes, because the idea of darkness confusing a grown man feels both thrilling and improper. A little girl then offers her own memory of hearing scratching beneath the floor one bitter night. Mice, says the older sister at once. Probably, says the mother. Still, the younger child tells it as if the floorboards themselves had opinions. You can feel the difference between adult explanation and child experience. Adults translate the world into causes. Children translate it into presence. Frontier children often played games indoors during winter evenings when space and energy allowed. Simple guessing games, word games, hand games, riddles, and little contests of memory were all possible without special equipment. A carved peg, a thimble, a button, a nut, anything small could become the centre of play. Here, one child hides a button in the folded hands while another guesses which fist holds it. There is whispering, cheating, protest, and triumphant accusation. The game lasts only a few rounds, but it changes the room. Tension thins. Laughter rises. Even the fearful corners seem to retreat a little. Then a gust strikes the cabin and every head lifts at once. The wind slides along the wall and catches near the roofline, producing a low, hollow note. It is not loud, yet it feels personal. A younger child draws in a breath. The father listens, then returns to his task. The mother says it is only the wind finding a gap, which is comforting, apart from the fact that a gap in the wall is not ideal winter news. Still, tone matters. Her calm voice lays a blanket over the children's nerves. You begin to understand that adults on these nights do more than feed and clothe children. They manage atmosphere. They keep the room from tipping too far into fear, too far into silliness, too far into fretful complaint. They answer questions without always answering fully. They redirect attention. They place another stick on the fire at exactly the right moment. This, too, is household work. A curious bit of old belief drifts through the conversation. In some rural traditions, a bird flying against a window or an unusual knock in the night could be taken as an omen. People in difficult environments often developed a rich vocabulary of signs, warnings, and whispered possibilities. Not everyone believed them with equal seriousness, of course. Some laughed them off. Some carried them quietly in the mind. A winter night, with little light and much uncertainty, is fertile ground for omen-making. The older children begin testing one another with dares so mild they hardly deserve the word. Touch the latch and come back. Stand by the door for 3 breaths. Look through the window and say what you see. This last challenge is the most dramatic and the least rewarding. What you see through a frontier window at night is generally your own reflection floating over blackness. Very haunting. Also not especially informative. One boy peers out anyway. The fire behind him catches in the glass, so his face appears to hover in darkness. For a moment he startles himself and jumps back. The others laugh. He laughs too, a beat later, with the slightly injured pride of someone betrayed by his own reflection. Childhood on the frontier included many such battles against ordinary objects temporarily promoted into mysteries. An older woman, if present in the household, or perhaps a visiting aunt or grandmother in some families, might carry the deepest well of oral tales. Tonight the mother offers one short account from her own younger days, about walking to fetch water at dusk and hearing sleigh bells in weather too poor for travellers. The sound came and went with the wind. No team appeared. She says it was probably echoes from the road. Probably does not satisfy the children at all. It is a marvellous word. It grants just enough reason to keep a mystery alive. Historians still argue over how much folk belief actually shaped daily choices in frontier households. Because memoirs often exaggerate for effect, while practical records understate what people felt and feared, many families balanced common sense with inherited superstition in ways too subtle to measure neatly. A person could laugh at omens in daylight and still dislike hearing unexplained tapping after midnight. Human consistency has always been somewhat overrated. The dog lifts its head suddenly and looks toward the door. That changes the room in an instant. No one speaks for 2 breaths. The children freeze in the poses they happen to occupy. The father turns slightly. The mother stops sewing with the needle still half through cloth. Then the dog settles again, having apparently detected either nothing at all or something beneath canine dignity. A collective exhale moves around the fire. The children are half relieved and half disappointed. Fear, when it passes harmlessly, can become entertainment almost at once. One of the older girls starts a quieter kind of play with the youngest child. She makes shapes on the wall with her hands near the candle. A bird beak opening and closing, a rabbit head, a strange long-nosed creature that no natural philosopher would recognize. Shadow play suits the room perfectly. The children watch the wall as if it were a stage. Their faces soften. The youngest smiles sleepily. Here is one of the gentlest uses of darkness, turning it from threat into toy. The candle burns lower still, and its smell becomes more noticeable as the hot tallow gathers and runs. The floorboards keep their chill. Your feet can feel it even while your face glows from the hearth. A draught brushes the back of your neck when the wind shifts. The cabin is never uniformly warm. Warmth exists in zones, little islands and channels. Children know where to find them instinctively. They drift toward laps, dogs, blankets, and the exact bricks near the hearth that still hold heat. A little boy asks whether wolves come close to houses at night. The truthful answer is yes. Sometimes, though not always with the melodrama later stories prefer, wolves did roam many parts of North America in 1850, and frontier families were certainly aware of them, especially in harsher weather when hunger drove animals nearer settlements. But many sounds blamed on wolves likely belonged to dogs, foxes, owls, loose boards, or pure imagination with very good timing. The father says wolves prefer easier business than prying into a cabin full of loud children. This earns a small smile, which is clearly the point. Another child wants to know whether ghosts can enter through chinks in the wall. A splendid question. The mother replies that if ghosts can survive this cold, they may as well come in and help churn butter. That settles the matter better than theology ever could. A ripple of laughter passes through the room. Fear retreats again, at least for now. Human has become one of the evening's best blankets. Not every child is equally comforted, though one grows quiet in the particular way that means sleep is near, but worry has not entirely let go. A hand rubs at one eye. A head rests against an older sibling's arm. The firelight catches soft hair, pink ears, heavy lids. Tiredness makes mystery stronger. The line between story and sound, shadow and shape, starts to blur at the edges. You can almost feel the room passing into that tender hour when children are most impressionable, and adults must guide the mood with care. So the conversation turns softer. No more eerie sleigh bells, no more scratching under floors. Instead there is talk of ordinary things. A calf with crooked markings, a pie once burned black as coal, a neighbour who sneezes like a musket shot. The children drift between hearing and dreaming. Their bodies slacken. One hand still grips a doll. Another lies over the dog's warm side. The shadow creatures on the wall dissolve as the older girl lets her hands fall. And there, in the mingled light, you see what winter nights in a frontier cabin could do to a family. They sharpened imagination, certainly. They made children conscious of every creak, murmur, and flicker. But they also taught a slower lesson. Fear was real, yet manageable. Darkness was large, yet shared. Stories could unsettle, but they could also soothe. A small room with fire, laughter, watchful adults, and a little practiced humour could hold back much more than cold. The shadows still move on the walls. The wind still searches the cabin seams. The window still reflects flame over blackness. Yet the children, gathered close in warmth and drowsiness, begin to yield to the hour. Their whispers thin, their questions shorten, their eyes close between blinks, and the room, which only a little while ago seemed full of lurking shapes and restless possibilities, grows gentler under the steady spell of tiredness, family presence, and the old frontier art of making night feel less enormous. Later in the evening, once the voices have softened and the children begin to droop, you become more aware of the cold itself. Earlier, the fire and supper kept it at bay. Work distracted from it. Talk disguised it. Now, with the room quieter and movement slower, winter begins to show its true character. It is patient. It does not bang at the door like a stage villain. It seeps. It waits. It finds the weak places. You feel it first at the edge of comfort. The front of your leg stays warm from the hearth, but your back cools under a creeping draught. Your hands, once rosy from washing bowls or handling warm food, stiffen again if left still too long. The floor keeps a steady chill that rises through boots and stockings. Even the blanket over your knees has two opinions. Toasty where the fire kisses it. Cool where the air reaches through. A frontier winter night is not a contest between warm and cold with one clear winner. It is a negotiation conducted inch by inch. The cabin walls tell the story plainly. Logs fitted together by hard labour can still shift, shrink, and settle. Chinking dries, cracks, and loosens. Clay falls away. Moss compresses. Tiny openings appear where the outside air presses through. During daylight, these floors look manageable. At night, especially in deep winter, they become personal. A draught touches the back of your neck from nowhere obvious. Candle flame bends and trembles. Someone reaches up without comment and stuffs a scrap of cloth into a narrow gap near the window frame. Many frontier families spent real effort trying to winterize cabins with the materials at hand. Mud, straw, clay, rags, moss, and even newspaper in later periods might be pushed into seams to slow the drafts. Some banked earth against outer walls. Some hung quilts or extra cloth inside. The work helped, but it rarely produced the kind of sealed comfort modern people expect. Cold remained a house guest that refused every hint to leave. The father rises and goes to the door. When he lifts the latch slightly to check it, A blade of freezing air cuts into the room so sharply that everyone notices. The youngest child winces. The older girl pulls her feet up beneath her skirts. The dog opens one eye in frank disapproval. The door is secured again at once, but that brief rush of cold explains the entire situation better than any speech could. Outside is not merely chilly, outside is waiting. The smell of the room has changed again as the night matures. Firelight brings out the sweetness in dry wood and the stale dampness in drying boots. Wool blankets hold a faint lanolin scent. Smoke lingers low, mixed with the tart edge of cold air slipping through cracks. Near the wall, there is also that unmistakable winter smell of timber and frost, clean and hard at once, as though the house itself were breathing carefully through clenched teeth. Bedding is brought out now, and with it comes a new awareness of touch. Straw ticks are thumped and turned. Feather beds, if a family has one, are shaken and fluffed. Though even feathers grow cool in an unheated room, sheets can feel almost alarming at first contact. Linen especially has a way of receiving your hand like a polite block of ice. This is one reason families often warmed stones or bricks near the fire and wrapped them for beds when time and caution allowed. The idea sounds lovely. The reality required care because overheated stones and bedding are not natural friends. Children are prepared for sleep with a practicality that leaves little room for ceremony. Shoes off, stockings checked, hands wiped, hair smoothed in a hurry. Nightclothes may be simple shirts, shifts, or whatever clean dry garments are available. On a hard winter night, extra layers might stay on rather than off. Sleepwear on the frontier was often less about elegance and more about not freezing with dignity. A child who resists bed is nudged along by routine and fatigue, not by lengthy philosophical argument. The chill near the sleeping area is always a shock after the hearth. You move a few steps away from the fire and feel the room change immediately. Warmth thins. The air gains teeth. A bed in the corner, a trundle pulled out, a rope bedstead, a loft reached by ladder. Each has its own relation to the cold. High places can catch rising heat from the hearth, but also drafts from roof boards. Low places avoid roof cracks, but live closer to the floor's stubborn chill. There are no perfect choices, only less difficult ones. A mainstream fact of frontier domestic life stands out strongly here. Many families shared sleeping spaces out of necessity, with several children in one bed, parents nearby, and sometimes guests or relatives fitted wherever room could be found. Privacy was scarce. Warmth was communal. Bodies made heat, and heat mattered. Sleeping close was not merely affectionate, though affection certainly lived there too. It was one of the most practical responses to a cold cabin. You can hear the bedding as it is arranged. Straw rustles with a dry whisper. A rope bed gives a small complaining creak. Blankets slide with a heavy wool drag. Someone pats a pillow that is more earnest than plush. The dog circles twice near the warmest remaining patch on the floor and lowers itself with a sigh that sounds deeply philosophical. Animals understood thermal geography extremely well. One child complains that the sheets are cold. Another complains that a sibling's feet are colder. Both statements are likely true. The mother tucks one blanket edge under a chin and tells another child to quit wriggling. The father places another stick on the fire, not large enough to waste wood, not small enough to die too soon. The balance matters. Overnight fires were often managed carefully, because no one wanted to wake to a dead hearth if it could be helped. Yet fuel had to last the season. There is an odd little winter custom in some rural households that speaks volumes about the cold. Nightcaps were worn not only for propriety or habit, but because keeping the head warm made real difference in an unheated house. A soft cap, a kerchief, or wrapped cloth could help preserve comfort through the night. It is hard to look majestic in a sleeping cap. Of course, winter has never been deeply interested in preserving majesty. You notice how many strategies are small rather than grand. A shawl stuffed against a window crack, extra stockings layered one over another, a warmed brick at the foot of the bed, curtains drawn around a bed if the family owns them, coats draped across a door, ashes banked over coals to preserve embers until morning. None of these actions conquers winter. Together, they make it bearable. Frontier survival often depended less on one heroic effort than on 100 modest precautions. The children settle with varying levels of grace. One is asleep, almost before lying down, mouth slightly open, hand still curled. Another squirms, whispers, rearranges, then finally drops into silence. A younger child asks whether the fire will stay lit all night. The answer comes softly. Enough. That is both reassurance and truth. On many winter nights, enough was the most honest promise anyone could make. The cabin sounds different once bedding is occupied. Movement becomes muffled. Voices fall low. Cloth rustles against cloth. The fire now carries more of the room's conversation, with its occasional pop and low, steady breathing glow. Outside, the wind has shifted. It no longer whistles sharply, but presses in long, cool currents against the walls. The structure answers with faint creaks. Logs contracting in the cold can make surprising noises, and anyone lying awake in a small dark room may supply dramatic explanations free of charge. Historians still debate how severe indoor winter temperatures typically were in ordinary frontier cabins, because memoirs often dramatized hardship, while some later recollections softened it with nostalgia. Conditions varied widely by region, construction quality, fuel supply, and weather. Yet it is clear that many homes remained chilly beyond the immediate reach of the hearth, especially at night when the fire burned lower. Romantic images of perfectly cosy cabins tend to leave out how often people woke cold. The mother kneels briefly by a bed to tuck in a child whose blanket has already escaped its duties. Her hands are rough, but gentle. The child smells faintly of soap, smoke, and sleep-warm skin. That small smell belongs only to households, and it softens the whole scene. The father checks the latch once more, then stands with his palms spread toward the fire, turning them front and back. The heat reaches one side at a time. Winter trains people to appreciate partial victories. Near the wall, a pitcher of water has developed the cold, dull look that suggests ice may visit before morning. In harsher weather, water left indoors could skim over or freeze outright if placed too far from the fire. Boots damp from melted snow may harden by dawn if not brought close enough to warmth. A washcloth can go rigid. Soap can turn stubborn. Morning begins its trouble long before anyone sleeps. You touch the quilt folded nearby and feel the difference in each patch. Some pieces are smoother cotton, others coarse wool, others soft with age and repeated washing. Quilts, coverlets, and pieced blankets could carry practical beauty into hard rooms. Pattern mattered less than function on the roughest edge of settlement, but people still made useful things pleasing when they could. Even a cold night does not entirely cancel the human urge to arrange scraps into order. A child suddenly pulls cold toes against a sibling's leg, and the offended protest that follows is immediate and heartfelt. This produces the briefest ripple of laughter among the adults. Here is the frontier at its most intimate and least heroic. Not bold pioneers staring nobly into destiny, but tired people sorting out whose icy foot has trespassed into whose blanket zone. History is very often like this when you get close enough. The fire is banked a little lower now. Coals glow red beneath a grey skin of ash. The room dims at the edges. Warmth shrinks closer to the hearth and asks everyone else to make other arrangements. This is the hour when the cabin seems largest in darkness and smallest in comfort. You feel the air cool on your cheek when the flames briefly drop. Then one pocket flares again, and the shadows jump. Another curious detail comes in the form of bed companions less celebrated by sentimental frontier art. Fleas, bed bugs, mice in walls, and the general inconveniences of shared human and animal environments were not unknown in rough cabins. Winter reduced some troubles and intensified others. Cleanliness was pursued as best it could be, but frontier conditions were not a polished museum display. A warm bed was a blessing. It was not always a perfect blessing. The father takes a stick and shifts the coals. A few sparks rise and vanish. He seems to calculate the night ahead in silence. How much wood remains near the hearth? How much ash will preserve the core? Whether the wind sounds stronger? Such thinking becomes habitual where warmth can fail. Even rest must be prepared like a task. One by one, the children stop speaking, their breathing evens out or stutters towards sleep. The room does not become silent. Exactly. It fills with quieter sounds. A soft cough, the fire settling, a roof board ticking in the cold, the dog dreaming in its paws, the mother folding one last garment, the father easing himself onto the bed with a slow care that admits the day's aches without ceremony. And all the while, the cold continues its quiet campaign. It gathers at the window, it lingers by the door, it waits beneath the bedstead and along the floorboards. It reaches through the chinks in invisible fingers and lays claim to every neglected corner. Yet inside these walls, people answer it with blankets, coals, shared warmth, patched bedding, careful habits, and the plain refusal to surrender the room. That is what winter in a frontier cabin really feels like by this late hour. Not dramatic suffering all at once, but the steady effort of keeping comfort alive against a patient enemy. The cold is never entirely gone. It lives just beyond the firelight, and sometimes within it. Still, the family bends the night to human use as best they can. Beds are warmed by bodies, cracks are plugged, coals are banked, children are tucked in, breath clouds faintly near the far wall. The cabin remains imperfect, draughty and vulnerable, yet stubbornly inhabited, and so you lie there with the household, listening to the low red heart of the fire and feeling the winter air move carefully through the seams, understanding at last how much of frontier life depended on enduring the cold not grandly, but well. Once the household has settled into its nighttime rhythm, a different kind of feeling comes into the cabin. It is not exactly fear and not exactly loneliness. It is the awareness of distance. During the day, distance can seem manageable. A neighbour may live a mile away, or 3, or 5, and that still feels like part of the same world when smoke rises in daylight and wagon tracks remain visible in the road. At night in winter, distance changes character. A mile becomes dark country. A familiar lane becomes an unseen gap. Another family may be nearby in theory, yet feel impossibly far once the last light is gone. You sense this most strongly when the room grows quiet enough for thoughts to stretch. The fire gives a low pulse. The wind shifts outside. Somewhere in the walls, the timber makes a soft, dry click as the cold tightens its hold. And in that pause between sounds, you realize how small one cabin is against the dark. It holds warmth, breath, and human company. But beyond the walls lies a wide black world with almost no sign of other people. This was one of the great facts of frontier life in 1850. Families often lived scattered across broad landscapes, separated by woods, fields, creeks, and rough roads that could become miserable in bad weather. Settlement did not always mean close-packed farms or cheerful village rows. In many regions, it meant isolated clearings with only occasional contact, especially during winter. A neighbour could be important, trusted, and well known, yet still remain physically distant enough that a visit at night was no small matter. Inside the cabin, that knowledge sits quietly in the room. The father glances once toward the window, though there is nothing to see except a dim reflection of the hearth. The mother folds her hands for a moment, thinking perhaps of weather, supplies, or simply tomorrow's tasks. A child asks whether anyone is awake at the Wilson place, or the Miller place, or whatever family lives across the frozen rise in this little corner of the frontier. The answer is probably yes. Someone there is likely banking a fire, checking a latch, or tucking in children just the same. That is comforting in a distant way. It is also maddening, because comfort does not travel quickly through snow. A strange tenderness belongs to this thought. You do not know what another cabin's room looks like at this exact hour. You cannot hear their talk. You cannot smell their fire, yet you can imagine it. Another mother bending over a bed, another father bringing in one last stick of wood, another child asking whether morning is close. Across the winter dark, whole families live in parallel, each one a small island of lamplight and labour. The social world of the frontier did not disappear in winter. It merely became harder to reach. Neighbours exchanged help, tools, news, food, labour and companionship whenever possible. Barn raisings, huskings, quilting gatherings, church meetings, court days, and market trips created webs of connection. But a winter night narrowed all that sociability down to memory and expectation. No one casually drops by after supper through a freezing wind and uncertain road unless there is a purpose strong enough to justify cold feet and a risky return. You can hear the absence of neighbours in the soundscape itself. There are no carriage wheels passing outside, no distant tavern clatter, no hum of a town street, no nearby porch conversation drifting through the air. The silence is not complete, because the frontier is never fully silent, but it is humanly sparse. The noises belong mostly to the cabin and the natural world. Fire, breath, wood, wind, perhaps a horse stamping in the barn. That is all. Then because the mind resists emptiness, talk turns toward other people. Someone mentions a family living downriver whose chimney was said to smoke badly in damp weather. Someone recalls a woman known for lending yeast starter when another household's bread refused to rise. There is a dry remark about a man who claims to know everything and still cannot keep a gate hung straight. These are tiny bits of frontier society, passed around by memory in place of actual visiting. In a scattered settlement, reputation travelled remarkably well. A person's habits, strengths, and foolishness could roam farther than the person did. Children are especially curious about neighbours at night. Daytime neighbours are easy to understand. They lend, visit, talk, help, argue, and appear in doors or roads. Nighttime neighbours become more mysterious. Do they sleep with their boots by the fire too? Does their dog bark at the wind? Are their children afraid of the dark? Such questions are really a child's way of asking whether other homes feel like this one, whether the world is made of many little rooms all trying to stay warm at once. A quirky little habit from many rural communities appears in conversation through the subject of borrowing. Borrowing on the frontier could involve far more than a cup of flour. Families might lend each other seed, tools, kettles, harness parts, moulds, spinning equipment, wagons, even labour itself. A neighbour who came to help split wood or sit up with a sick child was repaid not always in money, but in future help and remembered obligation. These exchanges formed a kind of social credit system built from need, trust, and long memory. It worked beautifully until someone failed to return a tool in usable condition. Human nature, naturally, survived the journey west just fine. The father says that if the snow deepens much more, roads may be poor for several days. That simple statement changes the air. Nobody reacts dramatically, because bad roads are a familiar reality. Still, you can feel the thought settle. When roads are poor, isolation grows heavier, a broken axle stays broken longer, a delayed visitor does not come. News waits. Help, if needed, takes time. The cabin becomes more self-contained, and self-containment is admirable right up until you wish it were not necessary. The room smells of gentle by now. The stronger scent of supper is gone. In its place remain wood smoke, warm blankets, cooled iron, and the faint must of stored things. The air near the door carries a sharper edge when wind slides through the frame. Touch becomes part of this awareness too. The bench near the wall feels colder than the chair by the hearth. A mitten left too long away from the fire turns stiff. The latch itself would bite a bare hand if grasped from outside. Some families did manage occasional winter evening visits, especially among close neighbours within easier walking distance. A sled over snow, a lantern protected from the wind, and determination could bring people together for carding wool, quilting, singing, reading, or simple company. Yet such visits required weather, strength, and will. They were pleasures earned against inconvenience. That is perhaps why they were remembered so vividly. Any gathering in winter carried a little triumph inside it. Tonight, though, no visitor comes. The road remains empty. The cabin keeps its own company. Historians still debate how isolated frontier settlers truly were in daily emotional terms, because census maps and travel accounts suggest both separation and strong interdependence. Some families lived alone for long stretches. Others formed active local networks despite distance and rough terrain. The emotional experience likely changed from household to household. A capable, self-reliant family might feel secure in solitude one week and painfully cut off the next. Distance was not a fixed emotion. It shifted with weather, illness, supplies, and mood. A child asks what would happen if someone knocked at the door this late. The answer comes after a short pause. They would be let in, of course, unless there was obvious danger. Hospitality on the frontier could be a serious moral practice as well as a practical one. Travellers, neighbours in trouble, and unexpected guests might be fed or offered a place by the fire, especially in harsh weather. This kindness was not always sentimental. It arose partly from the plain recognition that anyone could need help on a bad night. That thought brings the outside world closer in a strange way. Somewhere beyond the trees there could be a wagon delayed by mud or snow. A rider could be searching for a lane in darkness. A woman might be sitting up in another cabin with a feverish child. A man might be crossing a field to fetch help for a calving cow. The settlement is scattered, yes, but not empty. Human need moves invisibly through it. The dog lifts its head once and listens. Everyone notices, though nobody says so. Then it relaxes again. A false alarm, or no alarm at all. Still. For a moment the whole room had leaned toward the possibility of another human presence. That small collective motion reveals how alert families remain to visitors, trouble, or news. A knock after dark could mean inconvenience, fellowship, danger, or urgent need. It could also mean someone lost and very cold. Night sharpened all possibilities. On the shelf rests a letter, folded carefully, perhaps from kin farther east or south or back across an ocean. Letters were precious bridges over great distances, but winter slowed them too. Mail did not move by magic. It travelled by roads, riders, routes, and luck. A frontier family might read the same letter many times by firelight, savouring names, bits of home, and news already months old. In winter especially, words from far-off people could feel both intimate and painfully delayed. The older girl wonders aloud whether cousins elsewhere are seeing the same kind of night. The mother says likely not exactly the same, but cold enough in their own fashion. That answer has a quiet wisdom. One frontier family's winter is never identical to another's. Snow depth, house size, food stores, fuel, neighbours, and fortune all differ. Yet there is comfort in imagining others under dark skies, tending small fires and speaking low. A mainstream truth of social history emerges here. Frontier families were never as purely isolated as legend sometimes claims, because survival often depended on webs of exchange and mutual aid. At the same time, winter night could make those webs feel thin and distant. Both things were true. People belonged to communities, and they also spent long hours enclosed within the limits of one household's strength. The youngest child, only half awake, murmurs the name of a neighbouring family before drifting deeper into sleep. Perhaps he's remembering a recent visit, a shared meal, a playmate, a sleigh ride, or simply the pleasure of another cabin bright with different voices. Children often measure the world through the availability of other children. Adults think of roads, labour, and provisions. Children think of faces. The father rises to check the barn once more before bedding down fully. It is a short trip, but in this cold it feels significant. He takes a lantern, the door opens, a slice of blackness appears, then vanishes as he steps out and shuts it behind him. Immediately the cabin feels altered, smaller somehow, and more vulnerable. The mother listens without lifting her head. The older children stay still. You hear faint crunching outside, then the muffled clink of a stall chain, the low shift of an animal, and after a little while the returning tread. When he comes in again, he brings with him a rush of outer cold and the clean smell of night, snow, timber, frozen air. It clears the room for one swift breath. Then the door closes and the cabin gathers around itself once more. He says the animals are quiet. That is good enough. Even with no neighbours physically present, the evening remains full of them in thought. The family measures conditions partly by imagining how others are faring. Are roads passable? Did the Browns finish threshing? Has the widow at the creek enough wood? Will the preacher make it on Sunday if weather holds? Such concerns reveal the frontier's social truth. A household survives alone each night, yet never entirely alone in mind. And so you sit with this awareness of nearby absence, this odd companionship made of distance, memory, obligation, and imagination. Beyond the walls lie scattered farms and cabins, each holding its own little republic of blankets, coals, chores, and sleeping children. No lights shine between them, no voices cross the fields, yet the settlement exists in a web of remembered kindnesses and future exchanges, invisible in the dark but no less real for that. Winter night makes every family feel secluded. It also reminds them, quietly, that seclusion is not the same as abandonment. Somewhere out there, others are enduring the same cold, banking the same fires, and hoping for weather that keeps roads open and troubles small. The cabin cannot see them, it cannot hear them. Still, in the deep dark of 1850, that unseen fellowship may be one of the warmest things a frontier family possesses. By the time the night has deepened and most of the children lie half asleep, another kind of worry can begin to stir in a frontier cabin. It does not arrive with noise or spectacle. It arrives with a cough that lasts a little too long, a forehead that feels warmer than it should, a restless turning in bed. In daylight, small sicknesses can seem manageable. At night, especially in winter, they gather weight. The dark enlarges them, the cold sharpens them. Every ordinary symptom begins to sound like a question nobody wants to answer. You hear it first as a dry cough from the bed near the wall. Not dramatic, not constant, just enough to make the mother look up at once. A child shifts under the blanket and coughs again, this time with the raw little catch that tells you the throat is sore. The room does not panic. Frontier families had too much experience of discomfort to leap at every sign of trouble. But attention settles differently now. The father stops moving for a moment. The mother sets aside what remains in her hands. Even the older children, not fully awake, seem to sense the change in the air. Illness at night had a special power in a place like this because so much depended on timing and endurance. A person could not simply step into a brighter room, send for immediate help, or rely on some quick, reliable remedy from a nearby shop. If a child worsened after dark in a winter storm, the family often had to manage with what the cabin already held: knowledge, patience, herbs, warm cloths, broth, rest, prayer, and plain luck. Those were the companions at hand. The mother crosses the room and kneels by the child's bed. You hear the dry rustle of blankets as she folds one back slightly. Her hand rests on the child's forehead, then moves to the neck. Touch was often the first diagnosis available. Heat, dampness, chill, the pace of breathing, the feel of skin. These things told their own story. She says softly that the child is warm, not alarmingly so, just warm. The sort of sentence meant to reassure everyone, including herself. A winter cabin changes character immediately when illness enters it. The fire feels less cozy and more necessary. Water becomes urgent. Cloths matter. Quiet matters. The room's smells shift too. Smoke still hangs in the rafters, and wool still warms by the hearth. But now there is also the faint sharp scent of heated water. Perhaps vinegar, perhaps camphor or some herbal preparation if the family keeps one. A room that was drifting towards sleep becomes a place of watchfulness. Most frontier households had some collection of home remedies. These varied enormously by region, family tradition, ancestry, and access to goods. Mint, horehound, onion syrups, mustard plasters, goose grease, elder preparations, willow bark, boneset, and all a manner of teas and poultices circulated through rural life. Some remedies offered real relief. Others likely did little beyond giving a worried person something useful to do, which, to be fair, is not nothing. A family facing sickness by candlelight often needed action almost as much as medicine. The father rises and adds a small piece of wood to the fire, then reaches for the kettle. Metal touches iron with a quiet clink. Water is poured. The sound seems louder now because the room has gone so still. He does not speak much. He does not need to. On these nights, people settle into their roles quickly. One tends the child. One readies water. One checks the coals. One keeps the others calm. Family life under strain reveals its structure very clearly. The coughing child is lifted slightly and given a sip to drink. The cup touches small teeth. The child swallows, then turns away, sleepy and uncomfortable. You can feel the rough warmth of the blanket, the cooler air at the edge of the bed, the damp heat on a flushed face. Nearby. Another child stirs but does not fully wake. Shared sleeping spaces made illness impossible to isolate neatly. A cough in one bed was heard by all. A fever in one child occupied the entire room. A mainstream historical truth sits close to the surface here. Childhood illness was common in the 19th century, and frontier families lived with levels of uncertainty that would now feel brutal. Colds, croup, influenza, diarrhea, measles, scarlet fever, and countless other ailments moved through households with uneven force. Some passed lightly, some turned dangerous with frightening speed. Medical help existed, but doctors might be far away, expensive, delayed, or limited in what they could actually do. The line between minor sickness and grave trouble was not always clear. That uncertainty is what makes the night so tense. Not loud tension, quiet tension. The child coughs again. The mother listens to the chest. The father glances toward the door as if measuring distance in his mind. Could someone be sent for help if needed? Would the road hold? Is the moon bright enough, and is the snow crusted hard or turned soft? These calculations happen behind the face. They do not need to be spoken aloud for you to feel them. A curious and rather revealing detail of old household medicine appears when a spoonful of something dark is fetched from a small bottle or crock. It may taste dreadful. Many remedies did. The frontier was not a golden age of pleasant flavours and clinically tested syrups. A child's expression after swallowing medicine often served as strong evidence that adults remained committed to the principle that if something tastes terrible, it must surely be doing something important. This theory has enjoyed a long and ridiculous career in human history. The older girl sits up now, hair loose, eyes heavy, and asks if her brother is ill. The mother says only a cough. Go back down. The words are calm, but they do not entirely lower the worry. Children understood more than adults sometimes hoped. They knew when voices changed. They knew when a fire was built up at an unusual hour. They knew when a parent stayed standing instead of lying down. Outside, the winter night goes on with complete indifference. The wind brushes the roof. Somewhere a board gives a faint tick. An animal shifts in the barn. It is almost offensive, really. How normal the world sounds when one child in the room is struggling to settle into easier breathing. Sickness has a way of shrinking attention to one bed, one face, one cup of water, one pair of listening adults. Everything beyond that circle feels distant and slightly unreal. The mother heats a cloth and lays it gently against the child's chest or throat. The child sighs, then fusses. Heat is comfort, but also surprise. The blanket is tucked again. A hand smooths the hair back from a sweaty brow. The child's skin smells faintly sour with fever and sleep. A familiar household smell that can break the heart a little. There is such tenderness in these practical acts. Nothing theatrical. Just a hand, a cloth, a cup, a quiet voice used carefully in the dark. Some frontier families would have sent for a neighbour before sending for a doctor, especially if that neighbour was known for experience with births, herbs, fevers, or children's ailments. Women in particular often carried enormous stores of practical medical knowledge, passed through family and community rather than formal schooling. Yet night and weather could delay even that option. Much depended on whether the illness seemed common, worsening, or strange. The most frightening cases were often those that changed quickly, because speed robbed people of the chance to persuade themselves it was nothing serious. Historians still argue over how effective many home remedies truly were, because folk practice mixed genuine empirical knowledge with inherited beliefs, hopeful rituals, and treatments that range from useful to useless to actively harmful. Rural households were not ignorant in any simple sense. They observed symptoms closely and adapted from experience, but they also lived in a medical world full of uncertainty, conflicting advice, and limited tools. At night, in winter, that uncertainty became emotional as much as practical. The father moves to the shelf and feels around for whatever the family keeps there. A small packet of dried herbs, a bottle stopper, a folded cloth. His fingers know these objects by touch. He probably hopes not to need any of them often. There is a particular silence people keep around medicine, as though handling it too briskly might offend fate. Even the smallest bottle looks solemn in candlelight. The sick child's cough loosens somewhat after warm drink and time. Not gone. Softer. Less sharp. The mother remains beside the bed another while to make sure. Her own back must ache. Her eyes must burn with tiredness. Yet watchfulness can lend strange energy. Parents sitting up with children often appear to run on worry alone. The body complains later. Across the room, the younger child now sleeps through it all. Thumb tucked near the mouth, blanket kicked halfway free. The contrast is startling. One child feverish and restless, another sunk in complete trust. Family life always contains these uneven little realities, and winter night makes them feel sharper. Care cannot be divided equally by the clock. It gathers where need is greatest. A strange little frontier habit in times of illness involved onions, sometimes sliced and placed nearby, sometimes made into syrups, sometimes trusted for reasons that mix pungent experience with household faith. The 19th century possessed many sincere beliefs about what might draw out sickness, settle a chest, or protect a sleeper. Whether onions deserved their reputation is debatable. Whether they made the room smell unforgettable is not. The father finally sits again, but not fully at ease. He leans forward, elbows on knees, hands hanging between them, listening. The mother remains closer to the child. Every cough is counted now, though no one says so. Every easier breath is noted. The fire, too, is watched more closely. A warm room matters to the sick. Coals must not fail. Water must stay within reach. One minor illness reorganizes the household without permission. Then comes that peculiar hour known to every family in every century. The hour when a child seems either much better or much worse, depending on which frightened adult is doing the interpreting. The cheeks look less hot, or perhaps too pale. The breathing sounds easier, or perhaps too quiet. Fear is a poor diagnostician, yet a diligent one. It observes everything and believes the worst in alternating turns. The mother touches the child's forehead again and seems a little more satisfied. The child has grown heavier in sleep, less twitching, less troubled. The cough still interrupts now and then, but without that scraping insistence from before. Relief does not flood the room dramatically. It trickles in, a shoulder lowers, a voice softens further. The father exhales through his nose and stirs the coals with less urgency, yet the possibility of sickness has already marked the night. You can feel how vulnerable a frontier family remained, even in a sturdy cabin with food, fuel, and skill. Illness entered through no visible crack. It ignored strong walls and careful habits. It could begin with a chill, a cough, bad water, an infection, or simple misfortune. And once it arrived, the family answered as best it could with the tools of attention, experience, and endurance. The room's atmosphere slowly shifts again from vigilance toward fatigue. The candle has shortened. The air near the beds remains cool. Smoke clings lightly to the ceiling. A warmed cloth cools on the chair. A spoon sits in a cup with a faint medicinal smell. These little objects become part of the historical truth of winter night. Not just cabins and quilts and picturesque snow, but fever checks, worried listening, and parents kneeling on hard floors. The mother at last lies down, though not deeply. You can tell she's listening even with her eyes closed. The father does the same. Their rest is partial now. Frontier sleep was often light when sickness hovered. One unusual sound could bring a person upright. The body might be exhausted, but the mind kept watch in some small hidden corner. And so the cabin settles once more, though not quite as it was before. The cough still comes from time to time, but softer now, wrapped in blankets and drowsiness. The fire burns low and steady. Outside, the cold remains absolute. Inside, the household has answered one of winter night's oldest trials with warm water, rough hands, home remedies, patience, and a fierce ordinary tenderness. That is what sickness in the night could feel like for frontier families in 1850. Not always a grand crisis, though sometimes it became one. More often it was a stretch of uneasy listening, where every parent balanced caution against hope, and every small sign of improvement felt like a gift too fragile to mention loudly. In the dim room, with smoke overhead and frost beyond the wall, love becomes practical, sleepless, and very alert, keeping its place beside the bed until the child breathes easier and the dark gives back a little peace. Some nights, the greatest pressure on a frontier cabin did not come from within at all. It came from the world outside pressing close in darkness. Once the family has quieted and the fire burns lower, the land begins to announce itself in strange ways. Winter has a talent for making ordinary noises sound deliberate. A branch taps once at the wall and seems to be asking entry. Wind moves through the trees and becomes a distant, rushing crowd. An animal cries far off, and suddenly the black fields feel occupied by unseen lives with their own hungers and intentions. You lie there and listen, and the outside world grows larger with every sound. The first noise is a long dragging sweep across the roof, probably bare branches pulled by wind. It travels slowly from one side to the other, rough and dry. The youngest child, not fully asleep, stiffens under the blanket. The father lifts his head for a moment, then lets it fall back. He knows the sound. That does not make it pleasant. Familiar winter noises were often tolerated rather than enjoyed. The frontier demanded a practical relationship with discomfort. You did not need to like a sound to understand it. Then comes the wind. Not a gentle evening breeze, but a more serious current moving over open ground and through timber. You hear it before it reaches the cabin in full, a low gathering murmur somewhere beyond the field. Then it strikes. The wall gives a faint tremor. The chimney changes its note. A thin seam near the window whispers. Firelight pulls toward the draught for a second and rights itself again. Wind on the frontier could feel startlingly alive, not because people were foolish, but because a hard winter wind could alter comfort, safety, and tomorrow's work all at once. In 1850, weather was not background, it was structure. Snow depth changed travel, wood hauling, animal care, and the very possibility of visiting or seeking help. A heavy storm could trap a family close to home, bury paths, freeze water sources, and turn every outdoor chore into punishment. So when the wind rises at night, the family does not treat it like dramatic scenery. They treat it like tomorrow already arriving. The father sits up to listen more carefully. You hear the rope bed creak beneath him. The mother opens her eyes. No one speaks right away. The air smells of ash, of smoke, and that clean metallic edge that often comes before sharper cold. One child murmurs in sleep and curls tighter under the blanket. Another, awake enough to sense tension, whispers a question no one answers at first. Adults on winter nights often listen before they reassure. Reassurance is more convincing once the roof remains attached. A blast comes down the chimney and sends a scatter of sparks upward. The fire answers with a red flare, then a shower of little settling noises. The smell of wood smoke thickens briefly. Chimneys on frontier cabins were not always masterpieces of perfect drafting. Some were built of stone, some of mud and sticks, some of brick where materials and means allowed. A troublesome chimney could fill a room with smoke, throw back soot, or demand constant attention. Winter weather tested every flaw. The father rises and kneels by the hearth to adjust the wood. He moves with the calm speed of someone who has done this before. The poker scrapes softly through coals. A log is shifted. Ash slides with a dry hush. He adds just enough wood to strengthen the fire without wasting fuel. That balance never disappears. Even in rough weather, a family cannot afford to burn through winter supplies in one anxious night. Outside, another sound carries over the wind. It is a long wavering cry from somewhere beyond the tree line. The room goes still. Animal cries at night have always possessed a special gift for making human imagination sprint ahead of evidence. The sound may be a fox, an owl, a dog, or a wolf, depending on region and season. Some cries rise like a scream. Others drift like a mournful whistle. Many are far stranger than city people expect. A frontier family usually knew the common local sounds better than outsiders would. But knowing them in daylight and hearing them through a freezing dark are not quite the same thing. The father listens and says it is likely a fox. He sounds fairly certain. Fairly certain is enough for the adults. The children are less impressed by taxonomic precision. A frightening sound remains frightening even after being properly identified. The youngest pulls the blanket up to the nose. The older boy pretends not to care, which is the classic frontier method of caring very much. Wolves did still inhabit parts of North America in 1850, and frontier families were aware of them, especially where livestock were concerned. Yet many later tales enlarged every nighttime cry into a pack at the edge of the cabin. The truth was often more ordinary and therefore more believable. Wild animals moved through the same winter landscape, hunting, calling, and surviving as best they could. Most wanted food, not theatrical confrontation. Still, a hungry season could bring creatures uncomfortably near barns, pens, and stored feed. That possibility sends the father's thoughts toward the animals. He rises, reaches for the lantern, then pauses. Wind rattles something loose outside, perhaps a shutter or a hanging chain by the shed. He decides to wait a minute longer and listen. This is frontier judgment in its least glamorous form, not charging heroically into the storm, but asking whether a problem is real enough to justify freezing for it. The cabin's atmosphere tightens around these choices. You feel the rough blanket against your chin. The floor beyond it seems miles colder than before. The back of your neck catches a faint draft. The smell of warm wool is suddenly more precious. One of the children asks whether the mare is all right in the barn. The mother says yes, likely she's tucked into straw and wondering why humans make so much fuss. That earns a thin, sleepy smile. Humour remains one of the house's better defences. A curious little fact about rural winter life appears in the matter of sound itself. Snow can both muffle and magnify. A fresh soft covering swallows hoofbeats and wheels, leaving the world eerily hushed. A hard crust, however, can carry footsteps, sleigh runners, and animal movement in a crisp ringing way across surprising distance. Families became skilled listeners partly because the winter landscape constantly changed the meaning of noise. Now the wind begins driving something against the outer wall in irregular taps. Not a steady branch, not a hand either. Though in the first sleepy instant your mind offers that possibility with unhelpful enthusiasm. The father opens the door just a crack, peers out, then shuts it quickly. Snow blown from the eaves, he says, and a loose bit of brush caught near the side. The brief opening floods the room with savage cold and the sharp scent of the night. Frozen air, snow, timber, darkness. Then the latch falls back and the cabin closes around its heat again like hands cupped over a flame. That one breath of outside is enough to remind everyone how thin the barrier is. A frontier cabin kept winter out only by effort. A storm could test roof lines, freeze hinges, pack snow against doors, or creep under thresholds. Livestock needed checking. Water sources might ice over. Firewood paths disappeared. If weather worsened in the night, tomorrow's first hour would already begin in difficulty. The father sits again, but not deeply relaxed. He is listening to the weather as if it were a person talking just beyond the wall. Historians still debate how much later frontier folklore exaggerated encounters with dangerous wildlife and dramatic storms, because family recollections often favoured memorable nights over ordinary ones. A dozen uneventful evenings vanish from memory, while one howling gale with strange cries in the timber remains vivid for decades. Yet the underlying reality is plain enough. Night magnified vulnerability. A family enclosed in wood and blankets could not fully control the natural world around it, only read it, respect it, and answer it as best it could. The children's reactions create their own little weather indoors. One sleeps through everything with enviable faith in adults and architecture. Another lifts up at every sound and asks questions into the dark. The older girl tries to soothe the younger sibling with a hand over the blanket. The older boy listens in stern silence, as if by frowning hard enough he might personally discourage all predators, storms, and miscellaneous nighttime nonsense. The mother turns the talk toward practical things. If the morning drifts high, someone will clear the path first. If the wind holds, the wash can wait. If the barn door drifts shut, it will take both of them to clear it. This calm listing of tasks has a clever effect. It converts a threatening night into tomorrow's work. Once something becomes a chore, it stops being quite so mystical. Still, the outside keeps asserting itself. A horse stamps sharply in the barn, then again. The father stands for real this time. Lantern lit, coat pulled on, latch lifted. The door opens to a blast that seems almost physical enough to shove the room backward. Candle flame wavers. Children bury their faces in blankets. You smell snow and cold so pure it almost seems empty. Then he's gone into the dark, and the door shuts hard behind him. Those moments after a person steps outside are among the longest in any winter house. The cabin feels smaller and more exposed at once. The mother keeps her face composed, but her ears are turned wholly toward the night. You hear muffled steps, then less. The wind swallows most other sound. Time stretches strangely when someone is out in weather you cannot see. At last, there is the faint clink of the lantern, a short murmur from the barn, the slide of a bolt, then the return of footsteps on packed snow. He comes back in with shoulders dusted white. The horse had shifted and kicked at the stall. Nothing worse. The barn door needed bracing. He says it simply, as though he has stepped into moderate inconvenience rather than a dark, freezing yard whipped by wind. This too is frontier habit. Survival often depended on treating necessary hardships as ordinary enough to be done. The mother takes the lantern while he strips off gloves stiff with cold. His hands hover near the fire. The skin across his knuckles is reddened and dry. Warmth returns slowly. You can almost feel the sting in his fingers. A child peeks out and asks whether he saw anything. He says only snow moving sideways and the mare giving him a look of criticism. That wins another tired little laugh. The room settles again, but not into complete ease. Weather has a way of lingering in the mind after the sound softens. The roof still creaks now and then. Wind still circles the chimney. Somewhere far off another animal calls, or perhaps the same one. Yet the immediate danger, if there was danger, has passed. The barn stands, the fire holds, the door latch remains firm. Often that was victory enough. One odd and practical frontier habit in storm country involved placing tools, extra wood, or even a shovel where they could be reached quickly if drifting snow blocked the door by morning. People living close to winter learn to prepare for inconvenience before sleep rather than greet it half-frozen at dawn. Such habits rarely appear in romantic paintings, but they reveal a great deal about how closely people studied weather's temperament. The children begin to yield again to drowsiness now that the adult who stepped outside has returned. Their questions slow, their breathing deepens. The mother lowers the lantern light. The father gives the fire one more careful look, reading coals like a text he trusts. The room smells once more of smoke, wool, damp leather, and slowly drying snow from the hem of his coat. And the outside world remains there, vast and active, but no longer entirely unknown. That is the strange achievement of a winter frontier night. Storm, animal cry, moving branches, restless livestock, and black open distance all press against the walls. Yet inside the cabin, people answer each disturbance with listening, judgment, routine, and a little stubborn humour. They do not master the night. They endure it intelligently. So you lie within that fragile pocket of light and human order while wind goes on over the fields and wild creatures carry their own lives through the dark. The cabin creaks, the barn settles, the fire glows low, and each sound from outside reminds you that frontier families slept not in perfect peace, but in negotiated truce with weather, animals, and the immense winter land surrounding them. As the night stretches toward its deepest hours, the cabin begins to feel less like a workplace, and more like a place of habit. The hardest tasks are done. The children have mostly surrendered to sleep. The weather outside continues whatever business it has with the roof, the chimney, and the dark fields. Inside, what remains is routine. It is not glamorous. It does not announce itself as courage. Yet this is where much of a frontier family's endurance truly lives, in the repeated actions and quiet beliefs that carry people through one winter night after another. You can sense it in the way the father checks the latch almost without looking, in the way the mother folds a garment and places it where her hand will find it quickly at dawn, in the way boots are turned near the hearth but not too near, in the way a cup is left ready, water covered, ashes banked with care, and tomorrow's first steps prepared before sleep is fully trusted. These things are so ordinary they might disappear from memory. Still, They are what keep life from unravelling. Habit is often history's least celebrated force. People prefer stories of singular bravery, decisive moments, and dramatic turning points. But most frontier families survived winter through repetition. They knew where to set the lantern, they knew how much meal to spare, they knew which child kicked blankets free and which one woke coughing. They knew how the chimney sounded before a storm strengthened, and how the mare stamped when merely restless versus truly troubled. Such knowledge did not come from heroics. It came from living the same hard lessons until they settled into the body. The room has gone dimmer now. The fire does not leap, it breathes. Red coals glow under ash with a slow inward pulse, and now and then a low flame licks around a half-burned stick and shows the room in warmer outline. The smell is softer too. Smoke, wool, old wood, a trace of tallow, a trace of clean coal hanging in the seams of coats. The cabin feels worn in the best and most honest sense, not elegant, not fresh. Familiar. The mother sits for a few moments with her hands resting still at last. That stillness carries weight because you know how much those hands have done since before dawn. A day on the frontier often began in cold darkness and ended in it. Water, fire, food, animals, clothing, children, mending, preserving, cleaning, planning. All of it passed through human hands. To rest them, even briefly, is not laziness. It is a small act of mercy. Perhaps now a word of prayer is spoken. In many 19th century frontier homes, faith formed part of the structure of evening, whether through formal family prayer, a Bible passage, a hymn, or a quieter private appeal to God before sleep. Religious practice varied widely by denomination, region, and household character. Some families were devout in open, steady ways. Others believed deeply, but expressed it with less ceremony. Yet winter nights, with their cold uncertainty and daily dependence, often drew spiritual thought close to the surface. The father may bow his head. The mother may murmur a few lines from memory. The children, who are still awake enough to hear them, do so through heavy eyelids and warm blankets. The words are not grand theology. More likely they are simple requests. Protection through the night, health for the children, fair weather if possible, strength for tomorrow's work, gratitude for the day's provisions. Human beings in difficult settings often pray most plainly, and plain prayers can be very moving, even in households where formal prayer is brief or absent. There is often some ritual of mental settling before bed, a habit of naming tomorrow's tasks, a glance toward the shelf where food remains, a touch on a sleeping child's shoulder, a final look at the coals. Repetition itself can feel like faith when repeated long enough. It tells the mind that morning has come before and will come again. A mainstream truth of frontier life appears clearly here. Routine was not merely comforting, it was efficient. Families who lived close to material limits could not reinvent each evening. They depended on tested patterns. What to do with damp boots, when to bank the fire, where to place the axe before a storm, how to stack blankets, how to portion candle use. These patterns reduced mistakes, saved effort, and brought a measure of calm to circumstances that might otherwise feel chaotic. The older boy, not quite asleep, asks a question into the dimness. Will the creek freeze hard enough to cross by next week? The father answers that it may, if the cold holds. That answer is practical, but it also holds a frontier philosophy in miniature. Everything depends on conditions. Maybe. If the cold holds, if the road clears, if the calf stays well, if the barrel lasts. Frontier people often lived in a chain of guarded expectations, not because they lacked hope, but because experience had taught them to leave room for weather, illness, and bad luck. A small, curious domestic habit appears when the mother lays out clothing in order near the bed. Not fashion, certainly, rather strategy. The first garment to reach for in the morning cold should be the right one, and fumbling half frozen in the dark wastes both time and temper. People who wake to icy floors and reluctant fires become very good at arranging tomorrow while they are still warm enough to think kindly. The older girl shifts in sleep and mutters something about bread or geese or perhaps both. which briefly softens the adults' faces. Sleep talkers likely amused families for as long as people have shared rooms. On the frontier, with so many bodies sleeping close, a person's dreams did not remain fully private. A child might laugh in sleep, grind teeth, cry out once, or murmur nonsense into the blanket. These little sounds became part of the family's map of each other. The father finally lies down, though you can sense that some part of him remains attentive. Many adults in such conditions likely slept in layers, ready to rise if an animal cried out. A child became ill, or weather worsened. Sleep on the frontier was real, of course, but often conditional. It happened inside responsibility rather than outside it. Historians still debate how much frontier resilience owed more to belief systems versus sheer necessity, because memoirs and letters often emphasize moral strength, religious trust, or pioneer character, while material records point just as strongly toward labour, food stores, shelter quality, and practical skill. In truth, these were not separate worlds. Belief often reinforced endurance. Habit gave belief a daily shape. Necessity kept both honest. The fire settles lower again, and the room cools at the edges. You feel it in your fingertips, in the bridge of your nose, in the air above the blanket where your breath seems just a little sharper. The warmth is local now, clustered close to coals and sleeping bodies. Yet the room does not feel defeated. It feels arranged, prepared. The family has done what can be done. A faint scratching sound comes from somewhere within the wall. Mouse. Likely. Frontier cabins frequently housed more life than the human residents preferred. Mice, insects, and the occasional more ambitious intruder found shelter where grain, warmth, and cracks made opportunity. Nobody leaps up for war at once. The sound is noted, mildly resented, and filed away under problems for another day. A person cannot spend every night declaring battle on creatures the size of walnuts. There is a certain dry humour in frontier endurance. Not broad jokes always, but a way of meeting annoyance without surrendering dignity. A broken strap, a smoky chimney, frozen washwater, or a mouse in the wall could be cursed silently, mocked lightly, or endured with the expression of someone too tired for drama. Humour in such settings was less entertainment than emotional thrift. It kept bitterness from taking up space already needed for more useful things. The mother reaches once more to feel the forehead of the child who coughed earlier. Cooler now. Or at least not hotter. She lets her hand remain there one extra breath before withdrawing it. That tiny pause is full of feeling. Care on the frontier often looked like this. Brief gestures repeated quietly. Not because affection was small, but because work and fatigue rarely allowed it to perform itself at length. The wind outside has eased somewhat. You hear it now as a distant moving hush rather than a direct assault on the walls. The chimney speaks in a lower, steadier tone. A horse in the barn shifts its weight, then is still. The changing weather alters the whole mood of the room, as if a large hand has lifted slightly from the roof. Relief comes not with fanfare, but with a softer silence. One quaint but useful practice in some homes involved keeping embers alive under ash overnight so the morning fire could be coaxed back rather than built from nothing. Fire-making was labour, and dry kindling in winter was not a trivial matter. Preserving a live core through the night was an act of foresight as meaningful as saving bread or mending wool. Morning comfort often depended on what someone remembered to do before sleep. The children, deeply under now, breathe in uneven little choruses. One whistles faintly through the nose, another sighs at long intervals. The youngest has migrated sideways with astonishing confidence, occupying more blanket than seems mathematically possible. This too is part of family endurance, the comic unfairness of shared sleep. Adults make room. Blankets are tugged back. No treaty is signed. The more you observe, the more endurance appears not as hardness, but as steadiness. These people are not constantly proving themselves against the wilderness in dramatic poses. They are persisting through cold, fatigue, worry, and repetition with enough tenderness left to cover a child, enough discipline left to bank the coals, and enough humour left to note that the dog has stolen the warmest patch again. That may be a less cinematic version of frontier life. It is also a truer one. The smell of the dog, warm and slightly dusty, mixes with wool and smoke. The boards beneath the bed keep their chill. A rough quilt edge brushes your knuckles. In the dimness, familiar objects become simpler shapes: chair, chest, peg, bucket. Yet each one belongs to a chain of habit. The bucket must be checked at dawn. The chair moved back to the table. The chest opened for cloth or meal. The pegs used for coats once morning cold begins the day again. There is comfort in knowing what comes next, even when what comes next is difficult. Rise before full light, stir the fire, pull on stiff clothes, test the weather, break ice if needed, feed animals, haul water, start breakfast. Such a sequence does not make life easy, but it does make it legible. Routine is a map through hardship, and perhaps that is why faith and habit fit so naturally together in a winter cabin. Both say, in their different ways, continue. One says the world holds meaning beyond the visible cold. The other says put the boots there, keep the tinder dry, fold the cloth now, check the latch again. Between them, a family finds enough order to sleep, so the night passes deeper into stillness, and the cabin becomes a place held together not merely by logs and chinking, but by repeated acts of trust. Trust in routines tested many times. Trust in each other's labour. Trust that a banked fire may still answer in the morning. Trust that what has carried the household this far can carry it one more winter night. In that hush, with coals breathing softly and blankets rising and falling over sleeping bodies, endurance no longer looks like a single mighty effort. It looks like custom. It looks like prayer spoken low. It looks like clothing laid ready, embers covered, children checked, and weary adults resting at last inside the sturdy shelter of habit. That is how a frontier family meets the long cold hours, not with grand speeches, but with practiced steadiness, a little faith, and the quiet knowledge that survival is often built from things done the same careful way. Night after night. Now the cabin has reached that deepest part of the winter night when even the fire seems to breathe more slowly. The household is no longer busy in any visible way. No bowls are being cleared. No boots are being moved. No small repairs are being finished by candlelight. The room has fallen into the kind of stillness that only arrives after labour. Worry, weather, and weariness have each taken their turn. You lie within it and begin to understand what sleeping on the frontier in 1850 truly meant. It did not mean perfect quiet. It did not mean ease. It meant surrendering, carefully, to rest inside a place that could never entirely forget the cold. The fire has been banked low, beneath a skin of ash. The coals hold their red secret, sending out a modest warmth that barely reaches the far edges of the room. Their light is softer now, less flame than glow. It paints the underside of the table, the legs of chairs, the curve of a kettle left near the hearth, and the rough floorboards worn smooth in little paths by many feet. Shadows no longer leap. They linger. They drape themselves quietly over the chest by the wall, the pegs with hanging garments, the sleeping forms gathered under quilts and blankets. You feel the texture of the bed beneath you, every practical layer of it. The tick stuffed with straw or husks gives a dry, uneven firmness. The blanket above has weight and scratch, its wool retaining warmth where it can. A fold of quilt rests against your hand, and the seams are easy to notice in the stillness, each patch with its own softness, thickness, and history of wear. One spot feels smoother from many washings. Another is rougher where stronger cloth had to be used. Sleep here is never an abstract thing, it is deeply physical. You know exactly what holds you, what warms you, and what fails to. The room smells gentler now than it did earlier. The richer scent of food is long gone. Smoke remains, but softer. Warm wool, cooling ash, faint leather, a small lingering trace of tallow, the sharper edge of a night air sneaking in through a seam near the window. Beneath all of it is the smell of people at rest. Skin warmed by blankets, hair carrying traces of hearth and winter, the honest close scent of shared domestic life. Nothing here is elegant, but it is intimate in a way only hard living can be. A child stirs and sighs in sleep. Another breathed through the nose with a tiny whistle. Somewhere under a chair, the dog shifts, toenails scratching lightly on the boards before settling again into the warmest patch it can defend through sheer confidence. The mother, though she lies still, has the alertness of someone not fully surrendered to sleep. The father, too, seems only partly absent from the room, as though some useful portion of him remains listening for the barn, the weather, or the cough of a child. This is frontier sleep. It comes in layers, like clothing. One layer truly sleeps, another remains ready. The farther you drift into the experience of this winter room, the clearer it becomes that night on the frontier was not merely darkness between work days. It was a test of trust. You had to trust the roof over your head, trust the coals to hold until morning, trust the latch, trust the patch blanket, trust the weather not to worsen beyond what the cabin and barn could bear. Trust your own body to wake when needed. Trust that tomorrow's wood pile, meal barrel, and water source would still be enough. Trust, above all, that the ordinary preparations of tired human hands had done their work well enough for one more night. That trust was never absolute, it was measured. A louder gust reaches the cabin and moves over it with a low rolling pressure. The wall answers with a faint complaint from one log settling against another. Nothing more. The room remains secure. A moment later, a loose little cascade of powdery snow slips from the roof edge with a muffled sigh. If you did not know the sound, you might imagine something stranger. But frontier families learned the night by ear. They learned what could be ignored and what required action. A great deal of peace depended on knowing the difference. One of the more curious realities of sleeping in a frontier cabin is how much the body itself became part of the heating system. Shared beds, clustered children, dogs near the hearth, adults angled toward the warmest part of the room. All of it created little pockets of heat that mattered. Solitude is overrated when the walls are drafty and the floor bites through stockings. Practical closeness shaped family life in ways both tender and unavoidable. The youngest child has somehow turned half sideways, occupying far more blanket than seems fair under any legal code. An older sibling, too sleepy to object properly, tugs one edge back and resettles with a sleepy grunt. No one fully wakes. Such small negotiations continue even in dreams. A frontier family sleeping in winter is not a still picture. It is a low, ongoing adjustment of limbs, covers, and shared warmth. Outside, the dark remains complete. You cannot see the road, the field, or the tree line, yet you know they are there. The barn stands under frost. The path to the woodpile lies buried or stiff with frozen ruts. The water bucket will be colder by morning. The axe handle near the door waits for another day's work. Night has hidden the landscape, but it has not erased obligation. The frontier did not pause while people slept. It merely withdrew from view and prepared tomorrow in silence. A mainstream fact of 19th century rural life is almost impossible to miss here. Nights were longer and more physically felt in households without central heat, electric light, and modern insulation. People knew darkness differently. They knew the exact patch of floor where the board stayed coldest. They knew the smell of a chimney drawing badly. They knew the little ache of lifting warm hands away from a fire and feeling the air reclaim them. Sleep happened within that knowledge, not apart from it. There is also the mental side of it. Less visible, but just as real. To sleep on the frontier meant resting within uncertainty without letting uncertainty devour you. Perhaps the weather would ease. Perhaps the road would vanish in drifted snow. Perhaps a child's cough would be gone by morning. Perhaps the mare would stand easy in the barn. Perhaps nothing dramatic would happen at all, which was often the best possible outcome. People who lived this way learned to build calm from incomplete information. That is a difficult skill. It deserves more respect than it usually gets. Historians still debate whether later memories of frontier winter life lean too heavily toward misery or nostalgia, because recollections written long afterward often bend one way or the other. Some writers remembered unrelieved hardship. Others softened the edges into cheerful rustic comfort. The truth likely rested in the tension between them. A winter cabin could be wearying, cold, smoky, cramped, and physically hard. It could also be deeply affectionate, structured, and meaningful, Human beings are annoyingly capable of suffering and tenderness in the same room. The mother shifts slightly and reaches toward the nearest child without opening her eyes. Just a quick touch at the blanket edge, checking that it still covers the shoulder. Her hand returns to rest. That one motion tells you nearly everything about family life. Love here is not separate from fatigue. It acts through fatigue. It wakes in the middle of the night, fixes the blanket, and lies back down. The father clears his throat once, quietly, then settles again. Perhaps he's thinking of dawn already. Men and women on the frontier often slept with tomorrow standing nearby in the mind. There would be ashes to stir, wood to split, animals to tend, water to bring, breakfast to make, cold clothes to pull on, and whatever fresh nonsense the weather had arranged outside. Yet sleep still mattered deeply. Bodies driven too hard paid for it. A family could not flourish on grit alone. Rest, however imperfect, was one of the household's real provisions. A quirky little custom in some cold rural homes involved placing the next day's clothes where they might catch a hint of warmth from the hearth, or remain at least less brutal by morning. It was a small mercy. Pulling on garments cold as the room itself could make a person regret being alive before dawn had even properly begun. Frontier ingenuity was often just the art of making tomorrow slightly less unpleasant. Somewhere in the wall, a mouse scratches again. The sound is tiny, almost comic in the stillness. The family does not stir for it. Mice have their own opinions about winter lodging, and rough cabins offered opportunities they were shameless enough to notice. The night contains many such imperfect companions: draught, soot, mice, damp boots, a blanket tugged by a sibling, a bed rope that gives a complaining creak every time someone turns. Comfort on the frontier was always real, but never pure. The fire settles lower, the brightest red fades inward. The room grows more shadowed. Though not entirely dark, banked coals have a watchful quality. They are not lively, but not dead. They wait. Morning depends on such waiting things. Ash over embers, bread dough kept from freezing, a pail placed where it may not ice entirely, tools left ready, habits laid down like stepping stones across cold hours. Much of frontier survival consisted of helping useful things endure the night. Your own body responds to the room in frontier fashion. One cheek cools when you turn away from the hearth. Toes search for deeper warmth in bedding. Hands tuck themselves inward. Breath warms a little pocket of air beneath the blanket edge. People sleeping in heated modern homes rarely think about the geography of warmth. Here, every sleeper becomes a little cartographer, finding the better corner, the thicker fold, the safer distance from the wall. A child mutters in sleep and then laughs once, softly, as though some dream has briefly improved the terms of existence. That small sound is one of the strangest comforts in the room. It reminds you that even within hardship, minds continue to make their own weather. A child can dream of summer berries while snow gathers outside. An exhausted adult can drift into sleep still hearing wind, yet also sensing home around them. The human imagination, for all its talent for fear, can be unexpectedly kind. The cabin now feels less like a structure than a living arrangement of care. Every object has been placed by necessity. Every blanket has been patched or shaken or folded by hand. Every log in the hearth was cut, hauled, stacked, and carried. Every sleeping body has spent the day earning the right to this poor, precious warmth. Nothing here arrived by convenience. That gives the room a gravity difficult to reproduce in easier times. It is humble. It is tired. It is deeply inhabited. As the final hours of night gather, the sounds become even fewer. The wind is more distant now, or perhaps your ear has adjusted. The barn remains quiet. No cough rises sharply from the beds. The fire holds. The cabin, for this moment at least, is enough. There is no triumphal music in that fact, only relief, plain and substantial, enough bedding, enough coals, enough shelter, enough health, enough quiet. On many frontier nights, enough was a kind of abundance, and so you lie there inside a world reduced to essentials: wood, wool, breath, ash, frost beyond the wall, human closeness, animal warmth, weariness, trust, The frontier in winter strips away every decorative illusion and leaves a family with what truly supports life. That can feel severe. It can also feel clarifying. By night's deepest hour, nothing remains but what matters. Now the cabin settles fully into that stern and gentle truth. The blankets rise and fall. The coals breathe faintly. A hand rests near a child's shoulder. The dog dreams by the hearth. Outside, the winter land waits in darkness for the first grey hint of morning. Inside, the family sleeps as people have always slept in hard seasons, with caution, with closeness, with bodies turned toward warmth and minds half trusting the dark. And in that final stillness, you understand what winter nights were really like for frontier families in 1850. They were long, imperfect, uneasy, intimate, cold at the edges, and full of small acts that held life together. Not a painted fantasy, not only a trial, a human night, dense with labour's aftermath and love's quiet persistence. Carrying a household through darkness until dawn could begin the whole demanding, ordinary miracle again. The last of the warmth lingers close. The room drifts. The cabin breathes with its sleepers. Beyond the window, the unseen fields rest under frost and starless dark. Within these walls, tired people have done all that can be done. The latch is fastened. The coals are banked. The blankets are tucked. For a few precious hours, the long winter night is allowed to pass around them while they sleep in its narrow shelter. Now the words soften with the room. You let the roughness of the blanket become familiar. You let the fire's dim red glow grow smaller and gentler. You let the sounds of the cabin settle into a quiet pattern. Breath, ash, wood, the faintest stir of sleeping bodies. Outside, the fields lie still under cold darkness. The trees hold their silence. The barn keeps its animals warm in straw and shadow. The road, the fence line, the frozen ground all disappear into the same soft black. Inside, there is enough warmth to rest, enough shelter to close your eyes, enough nearness in the room to make the night feel bearable. You do not need the cabin to be perfect. You only need it to hold, and it does. So you sink a little deeper into the hush of this winter place, where every hard day ends in the same humble wish for safety, sleep, and morning light. The family drifts through the cold hours together, wrapped in wool, in weariness, in habit, in care. The coals keep watch a while longer. The walls stand firm. The night stretches onward, but no longer feels endless. At last, even the last little worries grow quiet. The wind moves farther away. The darkness loosens, and the cabin, small against the frontier and sturdy against the cold, rests at the centre of the sleeping land like a single warm thought.